So let me come to the thematic focus of today. We have with us Birgit Englert, who's a professor of African Studies, as I already mentioned. And in recent years, her research focus has been on global mobility studies and specifically solidarity between South Africa and Palestine. This is also what her talk today is going to be about. She will tell you more about that in detail, but let me also just mention that Birgit Englert was awarded her venia legendi in 2023. And she has recently published many papers on the solidarity between Black and/or African actors in Palestine. And yeah, she has received her habilitation with great reviews of the reviewers as well. And she also directs a third-party funded project, Rastafari Reasonings on Africa in Historical Perspective. She teaches at the Department of African Studies and, as I know, regularly receives very good feedback of her students. So yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here today to learn from you. After the lecture, we will take questions. I will moderate and yeah, enjoy.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Maya, for those kind words, and thank you everybody for coming this Wednesday afternoon. I appreciate it a lot. And yeah, as you just heard, I'm a staff member of the University of Vienna. And although I'm really grateful that this space has been provided, I want to say that I find it quite incomprehensible that the University of Vienna now even denies rooms for their own staff to speak. It's pretty ridiculous, to say the least. And especially as I'm going to speak about the very same research, which I also regularly present in my teaching. Yeah, it's a new, how to say, Tiefpunkt in this long history of cancellations that we have experienced in the last couple of years. And I personally had my first experience in 2018. So I've had 7 years now of what I call kind of participatory observation of what is happening in this debate, which is tried, which they try not to let it happen. I think just a few introductory remarks on this context before I turn to my topic. But I really want to state that I think the worst thing is this canceling without any debate. And this is happening again. And it just makes me crazy that there's no one really willing to take us serious as experts in the field from the side of the university administration. We're publishing, we're teaching. I'm not just speaking of myself, but of several other colleagues. Part of them are also presenting this week, but also others. And the administration just ignores this knowledge. So we're in the very topic of knowledge production, whose knowledge counts, whose knowledge is valued, and whose is simply regarded as irrelevant, as activist something, but not scientific knowledge. So yeah, this is obviously not acceptable. But I think, yeah, it's nothing new, so I don't want to spend too much time here just to state explicitly. I think institutions should only create the framework, but not presume to have any expertise on those topics. And as I'm a person that is paid by public money, I think my research should also be made available to everybody in the public space. So it's such a contradiction that I'm getting paid by this university that doesn't want to take my research seriously. So yeah, and obviously, I mean, any scientific debate has different positions. That's out of question. So we all have different positions, and the university just doesn't provide space to exchange those positions. I'd be very happy to be invited to a roundtable organized by the rectorate. So if anybody listens from this side, I'm available. Yeah. So yeah, there we are. And now I want to share with you some research that I've done in the last 4 years almost, and it's finally out as a publication about the underground solidarities that took place in South Africa from the late 1960s to the 1990s, basically. So actually, this talk is split into 2 parts. I first start with this historic case study, which focuses on South Africa specifically, and then turn to solidarity delegations in the open space, which are not happening as clandestine projects. And there, the geographic focus is on Palestine. And it's actors from various backgrounds, among them also South Africans, but not exclusively. Mainly, I also talk about Black US American activists. And as you'll see, or I hope I can make a convincing argument that it makes sense to examine those very different contexts together. Yeah, I might talk too long, so please just stop me when it gets too much. Yes. So this first part is based on this research just published. And the whole idea was actually came from engaging with the work of Veronica Thrills. And this actually links to what I just said earlier, because Veronica Thrills, member of the armed struggle in South Africa, was invited also to Vienna in 2019. And he was denied the opportunity to speak in Vienna because he was a guest of the BDS movement. And so he was disinvited from the Volkskunde Museum, and he ended up speaking in a restaurant in the 10th district. And so I met him there and became aware of the many autobiographies that he had written, and first wrote a paper about his autobiographic writing. But then I also learned about his crucial role in organizing clandestine solidarity over several decades. And he was so kind to share his contacts, the networks, to provide me with access to the people who had actually gone on those missions. And this was, yeah, a very interesting experience, and I'll talk about it in a second. I just want to give you a little bit of context for those who are not so familiar with the South African struggle. Basically, we have those debates on what actually brought apartheid down in the end, whether it was external influences or it was the armed struggle, or what was actually the role of the armed struggle. And all those debates have occupied academics for some while. And I think what is important to note is that people who were involved, like Casrills, actually emphasized that it was 4 pillars that were important. And we have to see them all as interconnected. We have to see the political struggle of the masses in South Africa. We have to see this underground network that helped to support them. We have the armed struggle, which was also interconnected, and we have the international solidarity that happened in the open space. And yeah, so this is crucial to know. And then just very briefly what happened after the arrest of Nelson Mandela and several others in the early 1960s, 1964, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4, I'm not entirely sure now. Most people fled the country and went into exile. It was it had become impossible for most South Africans to stay in the country. And so people like Oliver Tambo, who you see here, who was the president of the African National Congress at the time, went to London. And there he came up with the idea to look out for young people who could actually enter South Africa without any problems and move around within the country and take over tasks that South Africans were no longer in a position to do. So we have this interesting, change of spaces, and yeah, it was. Let me just have a look here. Yeah, so it were white people in the first decades up to the mid-80s primarily, simply because the racist system of apartheid South Africa classified people according to skin color, and people classified as white could move without problem, whereas others could not. So the whole logic of the apartheid state was used against it. And yeah, so I'll talk more about who were those people and how did they cope with this situation. I want to differentiate between 2 generations, basically. The first one, which came from 1967 on, and which came on short-term missions. So they came basically as tourists for a couple of weeks and took over tasks like sending letters. I mean, you have to imagine that the system was controlling letters coming from outside the country. So it was not an option to send the letters from London to inform other activists, but they had to bring the letters in the suitcase and then to post it to very slowly from different post boxes within the country. That was one thing that happened. Another thing was they also had leaflets exploding in public spaces. That was also something that worked pretty well. They disposed of a bucket with leaflets, a little explosive, then left the place, and then later it was just flying around, and people who, for example, at train stations, so public spaces that were pretty crowded, they could just grab a leaflet. And on the leaflet, it was simply saying, this is the ANC speaking. The ANC is still alive. The ANC has gone into exile, but we're still there. So you have to imagine the whole function was, or the whole sense was to remind people that they should not lose hope, that the struggle was still going on. So that, yeah, was very crucial. And in the 1976, as we can see here, we had the big change as the uprising in Soweto happened. And this actually mobilized also many Black South Africans to join the armed struggle. So we had a whole new logistics also emerging, and actually the role of recruits, as they called themselves, also changed. So it was not no longer people moving with a little suitcase from London, but they were mostly staying for a longer term, several years even. And they were involved also in smuggling weapons, in burying weapons. And so it was a whole different role which they had assumed. But this just as an overview. Now I want to say a few words about Ronnie Casrills, because he was such a crucial person. He was the person tasked by Oliver Tambo to find those people, because obviously you couldn't just ask on the street, would you like to go to South Africa and smuggle weapons? But he had to build trust and find those people, and he mostly found them at the London School of Economics, where he was studying at the time. But a few words who he became after this. He spent 27 years in exile, returned to South Africa in the early 90s, and then became a deputy minister, first in the cabinet of Nelson Mandela, and then also in the two following administrations led by Thabo Mbeki. He became Minister for Water Affairs and Forestry and the Minister for Intelligence Services. Until 2008, he was active as a politician in the ANC government, and then he had some, Jacob Zuma was elected. He had some differences with him, which he wrote about at length in this book here, A Simple Man, one of his autobiographic writings. And then he resumed the role of an activist. So he came as a liberation fighter, he became a politician, he then became an activist, and especially an activist on Palestinian rights. So that's one of his main concerns. He's now 87 and he's still very active and speaking out publicly, publishing pieces, and it's really incredible. So he published all those books. I really recommend that you read them. We also have them in our library of African Studies. You can find them there. And however, the corpus of what I want to talk about basically is in two other books. And the first one is this one. It's called London Recruits, The Secret War Against Apartheid. It was edited by Ken Keeble and already published in 2012. And here I briefly want to show you a screenshot of Ken Keeble speaking at our webinars. Because he was also a crucial person. He was one of those the first generation of recruits who went to South Africa, and he talked about how long it took him to actually talk about those experiences and to publish about those experiences. So he started in the year 2005. I mean, there we are more than a decade after the end of apartheid. To speak out about things that happened in '67. I find that quite fascinating, how long it took people to really overcome the secrecy. And then he actually looked out for others. And so you also have to imagine it was a context not like today, where we have networks and support each other, whatever. But those people had to work on their own. Maximum was like 2 sometimes. But otherwise, they didn't know about who else was involved for security reasons. And so he edited this book. And what I find so valuable also for us is that this was not a project by a professional historian. This was really a project by someone who was involved and who took over this editing task. So it's also, if we think about decolonizing knowledge, I think this is a very nice example of really a history not being written by those who are outsiders, except me now, of course. Now I'm taking up this and writing the analysis. I'm aware of this irony, but still, I think it's very interesting to have this documentation available. He also created a website where you find even more additional memories, and you also find several book launches online and so on. So we don't have time to go into that. I want to present briefly the other book, which was important for my analysis. That came out in 2021, and that was actually edited by Ronica Thrills himself, together with 2 other records. So it was the same logic. People involved came up with the book. And this one contains actually 2 parts, one on clandestine solidarity, the other one on open solidarity, the anti-apartheid movement. And there is lots of literature, obviously, on the anti-apartheid movement in the open. But these books are the first to talk about the clandestine dimension. So I had this great privilege to invite Ronica Thrills to one of my seminar sessions 4 years ago. And he gave an interesting talk, and then he had also invited others. And then we decided on the spot to organize an event where people would come together and speak. And I think it was a very also in terms of research methodology, if you want to think about it that way, it was a very interesting experience to have this webinar of where people met who actually either hadn't seen each other for like 4 decades, or who just discovered that others had also been involved. So it was really like a community building space. So a webinar, often it's a very dry and not so atmospheric, I think. But here, everybody who was participating was really touched by the emotions that were also exchanged. And it lasted for almost 4 hours, and we recorded it. And much of what I'm quoting from is from this webinar. We also had others, together with the history workshop at the University of the Witwatersrand, for example. But yeah, let's get into the more interesting stuff. I have a quote here from one of the female recruits, Mary Chamberlain, who later also became a historian and novelist herself. And she was a recruit in her early 20s. So that's a feature that all recruits actually shared. They were very young in their early 20s. And and she reflected about what, perhaps we should probably read the quote, but to summarize it, about the impact of this secrecy on the memory of what happened. So she said, it happened nearly 50 years ago now, and I think the memories were created with too much fear-induced adrenaline. Then there were buried so deep to be processed into neat narratives. And we could never talk about our mission for fear of compromising security, even after the regime had fallen. And we learned to lie. You know, people often saying, South Africa, have you been there? No, we said. That was a big topic of how to process those experiences. And as will come out later, people found it very challenging for their whole lives, basically. But a few more words on how they actually talked about how they became aware. And there, I think we can differentiate between those recruits had different class backgrounds. So there were those who were, as I said earlier, found at the university, especially the LSE, the first generation. But there were also many from the youth wing of the Communist Party in Britain. So that were those two main backgrounds, I would say. And those from university context sometimes came from middle-class families that had taken them to different countries in the world. So some explained that the experience of seeing injustices in different contexts from South American countries, in the US context, that this had actually politicized them. Whereas others, like here the quote by Eddie Donnelly, said for him it was basically Margaret Thatcher speaking about South African freedom fighters as terrorists, and that was a moment when he heard that on the radio that politicized him. So I found it interesting that most people could name it very precisely of what had actually politicized them, and yeah. So Ken Keeble put it in a way that he said, when we strike a blow against apartheid in South Africa, when we did that, we were also striking a blow against the British capitalist class and the British capitalist state. And that was my motivation. So I think this is very relevant to see the interconnectedness of struggles that was very clear to them at the time also. So while all those people were obviously very politicized, very aware, still they emphasized that coming to South Africa was just beyond what they were able to imagine. So we have again Mary Chamberlain here saying, I mean, we knew about the iniquitous nature of the regime, but to see it actually operating in the flesh and not do anything or say anything was really a very cruel twist that we hadn't quite anticipated. Because obviously they couldn't speak out in public, that was not their role. They had to remain in the clandestine sphere. And that was this whole struggle, internal struggle they had to go through. But what I think is important here, and also in relevance to the other cases that I'll talk about, is this value of actually going somewhere, seeing something, and creating knowledge through travel, and being able to speak about those experiences. Yeah. So I said we have those two generations here. We have another example from Andrea Meeson, a person who stayed for several years, who came in the 1980s to South Africa and then settled in Botswana. And she also talked about how her white privilege enabled her to get a job almost immediately without any training. So it was very easy on a practical level for those white people to settle. They found jobs, they found houses. That was not a problem at all. The difficult task for them was to cover their political convictions. And that was not so easy in this system where skin color was like tied to specific political convictions or thoughts. So what happened was that there were always different situations where activists fell out of their role, so to say. And I just have here a quote which I find interesting by Susan Krabek, who said, that's her own analysis, racism and sexism worked hand in hand to save the day, when she had actually a car stolen, which was not registered on her name. But then the system saw her as a white woman, and the police was very helpful to her because she was this white woman who was just a bit confused and rural, and so she could get out of this situation. So people were very aware of this privilege and how to use it. And also, interestingly, John Rose, for example, pointed at the hierarchies also within or among white South Africans, with British being seen on a higher level as those from the Boer backgrounds. So when he played the British tourist and emphasized, "Hey guys, I'm a British tourist," police backed off almost immediately. So there's several of those experiences, and I tried to analyze a little bit of what were the structures that emerged in all those memories. So what I probably should mention, but it's clear, obviously, I was reading those memoirs on the one hand, and I was also using the transcripts from those webinars as a kind of oral history. So what I was not doing interviewing, but I actually relied on those sources that were created by the people themselves. Yeah, I cannot really claim it was a very conscious decision at the time. It just happened like that. But when you reflect about your sources and what you actually are doing, then I found this quite a interesting thing to do for a change, because I've been used to interviewing people and to shaping the narrative to another extent than what I did here. So here I was more analyzing how people actually talked about those experiences. And and I also think this is an interesting aspect that Janet Love highlights here. Janet Love now is a person, white South African, who actually had to go into exile. And she noted in her contribution that the difference between the exile that she experienced and those people was exactly that in exile they could organize themselves, whereas those people had to stay isolated from each other. On the other hand, obviously, they had the privilege of having a passport that could allow them to leave the country at any time if they didn't get arrested before. What was also quite interesting, I think, was that people stressed what they call the kind of intergenerational trauma that had emerged, and the impact on the children, for example. There were several people who formed families in this context. They stayed for several years and raising children in a context where underground was something that they talked about as something that they hadn't really addressed enough. And also not only those white recruits, but also more generally, Tanjiwe Mkinso, for an example, was a black MK fighter. Umkhonto we was the term for the armed wing of the ANC, and in short, it's called MK. That's the abbreviation. So she was involved on the side of the MK, so she was kind of cooperating with those recruits. They supported her, they provided safe houses and so on. And she also said, well, it concerns all of us, the people on the MK side, but also those international recruits. We haven't really had space to talk about this. Yeah, so I'm just summing up this part, and then I move to the other part. Casrills also stressed very much that the value of actually talking about those experiences should not be so much to like glorify those, oh, you were so great and courageous and whatever, but to really think of what lessons can be learned also for other generations from those experiences. And he emphasized, for example, what we speak about tonight is relevant to struggles from Black Lives Matter to Polisario, to Palestine, to people fighting oppression all over the world, which is why the anti-apartheid struggle is so relevant to humanity. And yeah, I think there's nothing to add to that. It's interesting to me to see that almost all, or probably all of the people who had been involved in the South African solidarity work are today also involved in Palestine solidarity work. So there's a very direct connection on various levels. Most of them obviously are quite old now, from their 70s, 80s up to 90s, but they are still politically very active and make this very direct link, connect those struggles, because this is always an argument. I think we don't hear it as much anymore in the last 2 years, perhaps, but before there was always this attempt to say, well, apartheid in South Africa was something totally different and cannot be compared with apartheid in Israel and Palestine context. And I think by now we have enough publications that have examined the structural similarities, and so there's not much need, at least here, not much need to discuss this in detail. But still, I think it's valuable to see this perspective from people who were really, really involved in the South African context. So let me move on to solidarity delegations in the open. The example of Black Palestinian solidarity, this is based actually on an article which I published already 3 years ago. And it came out in our journal from the department, Stichproben, Vienna Journal of African Studies. So you can find the long version there if you're interested. And in this article, I first also tried to talk a bit about this context, omission of Palestine in academic spaces. And I mean, it's nothing new to you. I really like this example of Angela Davis. First of all, her book in English, as you can see on the left, was titled "Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine and the Foundations of a Movement." And the German translation reads, "Freiheit ist ein ständiger Kampf." There we are. So probably the designer just didn't have space for the subtitle or whatever, but I just found it very, telling that the reference to Palestine was simply deleted. And I mean, I don't know who was already around the University of Vienna in 2015. We had a wonderful celebration of 650 years of University of Vienna. And one of the main guests was Angela Davis. And she was speaking in the main building. And she was speaking also about the BDS movement. Nobody understood it at the time. The room was packed. Everybody was enthusiastic to have this icon of Black liberation in the halls of the University of Vienna. It was great. And I think I didn't check the link today, whether it's still online, but for many years it was online. Probably it still is, the full recording of this talk. And I always thought this was also quite a funny irony that they use Angela Davis to celebrate this university. Obviously they didn't listen to her in more detail. They should have done so. And I'll come back to Davis in a minute. I just want to say very briefly that there is great work on Black Palestinian transnational solidarities, BPTS as it's sometimes abbreviated. For example, in the Journal of Palestine Studies in 2019, there was a whole special issue titled Black Palestinian Transnational Solidarity, Renewals, Returns and Practice, and was edited by Noura Erakat and Marc Lamont-Hill, who you might know both from a US context. And there they had several contributions who also give you more detailed histories of those solidarities, because obviously they didn't start just in the last decade, but have long history. You also find lots of history in this book, Black Power in Palestine, Transnational Countries of Color, written by Michael Fischbach. This is also a very interesting source. He worked with archival materials. And so if you're more interested in this dimension, I recommend this book. I think we should also have it in the library. And basically, what I want to stress, you probably already know, the main divide was at the time between people part of the civil rights movement and the more radical Black nationalists like the Black Panther Party. So they had different positions towards Palestine and Israel. And also we have to understand that it was a generational gap with the older generation seeing Israel as the promised land of a subjugated people, and the younger generation organized also in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for example, or the Black Panthers. They took the more anti-imperialist stand and saw the occupation and land seizures in Palestine as an expression of colonial oppression. So this is, of course, very, dichotomic, if you want, but sometimes we need a little orientation, and you can read all those sources and get a more complex picture. What is important is that those links that existed in the 60s, in the 70s, they weakened in the 80s and 90s for several reasons that Erakat and Hill give us here. We have to understand the impact of the FBI's COINTELPRO program, counterintelligence program, which actually, cost the lives of several people involved in the Black Power movement, and also led to the incarceration of several others. So that was a major impact. We had the end of the Cold War, we had the Oslo Agreement. So we had on different levels aspects that led to a kind of loosening of those ties. And we can say in the late 2000s, those solidarities between Black US Americans and Palestinians became again more visible. And I would argue an important role was also played by solidarity delegations, by people actually going there and seeing for themselves. And we'll hear what it meant to those who actually went. Just briefly, the context: we are in a time where also the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in the US context. So Davis reminds us that in 2012, for example, the killing of Trayvon Martin awakened people to the urgency of building anti-racist movements. And then it was the killing of Michael Brown in 2014 by a policeman in Ferguson, which made activists much more aware of the structures of racist violence. And 2014 was also a moment where in Gaza, the Operation Protective Edge happened, killing more than 2,000 Palestinians. So we had these two moments of violence, state violence, happening at the same time. And this made activists even more aware on the similarities. So it was the same summer of 2014. And okay, I don't have another slide here on this issue. And that led to different activities. For example, a video was created also where activists wrote a poem about the similarities that they see between those two contexts. So I would argue it was really a moment of renewal that people remembered that they already had a history of a common struggle that had been lost somehow. So we're like almost a decade ago. And what had also started even a bit earlier were those solidarity travels. The first from this generation that I could find was 2009. And it was a feminist delegation organized by the organization Code Pink, which traveled, among others, there was Alice Walker, part of the boat, or on board, not the boat, she was on a boat to Gaza also 2 years later, but that travel actually was overland from Egypt to Gaza. And other authors such as Jewel Bush. And Walker published this book, Overcoming Speechlessness, a poet encounters the horror in Rwanda, Eastern Congo, and Palestine, Israel. It's a bit small, you probably can't see it. So she published this book, and a quote that I've taken out from this book was that she emphasized the impact of seeing things with her own eyes. So I realized I had never understood the true meaning of rubble. Such and such was reduced to rubble is a phrase we hear. It is different seeing what demolished buildings actually look like. Buildings in which people were living, buildings from which hundreds of broken bodies have been removed. So thorough a job have the Palestinians done in removing the dead from squashed dwellings that no scent of death remains. That was published 2010. Angela Davis was part of another delegation from 2011, also a feminist delegation with people who had all experienced racism and apartheid themselves, either in the US context, like Davis, or also in other contexts. And they emphasized in their writings and speaking about those travels that still they were so shocked by what they saw, by the extent of the repression and the fact that the Israeli military made no attempt to cover up the violence and the segregated roads, the segregated pedestrian ways and all that. So they published a statement upon coming back. There was also Chandra Mohanty, part of this group. They published this statement actually asking for supporting also the boycott movement. And Mohanty published also an academic paper in which she reflected on this experience of what she saw on the ground, and then of coming back to an academic discourse where the relevance of this was simply negated, where there was no space given to the knowledge that she had experienced through or gained through her travels. So there's a lot of reflection. Who's interested, you also find this round table where actually the participants talked about what this journey meant to them 10 years later. I found that very interesting. So they came together also in 21 and exchanged what had happened after they had returned and how they could incorporate their new knowledge into teaching and so on. We don't only have those delegations, we also had more recent ones organized by a younger generation, like the Dream Defenders. That was a US organization which organized such. And a rapper, Vic Mensa, I have to admit, I didn't know him, perhaps you've heard of him. He was part of the delegation, as the logic obviously is to find people who can then talk and speak in public about what they've learned. So we don't only have those academics or writers, but we also have musicians and other people. And he published this piece, What Palestine Taught Me About American Racism. And yeah, I think you can read the quote where he reflects about this shift in how he felt privileged as a person with a US passport. And that was for him a new feeling that he had never experienced in being in the US. So I think this is also quite an interesting reflection on how, yeah, well, what privilege and positionality means in different contexts. So he notes also as insensitive as it sounds, it was almost a feeling of relief to be out of oppression's crosshairs for a moment, albeit a very short one. So, yeah. The comparison to the US context happens a lot in those writings and talks, but obviously also the comparison to the South African context. And we also have the Women's Boat to Gaza from 2016, where a lot was published, for example, by Anlay Naidoo. She's a South African who was selected as a delegation member. And her writing is especially interesting in terms of questions of positionality, because she writes about the discussions they had on the boat of what should actually happen if they would arrive, what would happen, what would be the message that the delegation members should convey to Palestinians. And there, her experience was that most white members said, well, we come to promote peace. And she was like, okay, but coming from a very, apartheid context herself, that had been overcome with partly also with an armed struggle. She didn't want to say, tell Palestinians how to achieve their liberation. So she reflects a lot on that. And also they were arrested by the Israeli police upon arrival, and I think it was pretty similar to what happened to the global Sumut flotilla of this year. But it's interesting, perhaps. I'm sure you're all very much aware of what happened this year, and I don't have any expertise or material to tell you about it. You have it on social media. I'm sure you followed it. I just think it's valuable to also know that it's not such a recent phenomenon. So those delegations have been going on for years. People have been writing, publishing about it. And actually what always shocks me is how little we acknowledge this knowledge. So this knowledge was there, it was all there. But even people that we invite to our university because we think they are great for speaking about historic injustice, what is past. And then we don't acknowledge that they're also speaking about injustice happening in the current context. We just ignore this. And this is, yeah, just so mind-blowing in a negative sense, how many scholars also involved in post-colonial studies, different levels, who even might claim that they are doing decolonial theory or whatever, or at least interested in decolonial theory. And then you can still ignore this part of Angela Davis' writings or Chandra Mohanty's writings or Alice Walker's writings. Yeah, it's sad. Anyhow, perhaps I'm coming to the end, actually. Just this last slide, also taken from the book by Alice Walker, because she also emphasized this, how to put this, yeah, simply, she met with the US ambassador to Egypt on her way to Gaza. And the ambassador, she says, a white woman with a Southern accent, mentioned the success of our civil rights movement and asked why couldn't the Palestinians be more like us. It was a remarkable comment from a perspective of unimaginable safety and privilege. So this whole idea of we have a common history, no, we don't. We have very different histories, and this is like the minimum that we have to acknowledge. A recent travelogue that I also recommend reading is The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates, an author who became known writing about racism in the US context from several years ago. And he actually traveled to Palestine as a delegation member in 2023, May 23, I think. And his book was published last year, and you also find lots of roundtables where he speaks about his book. And what's interesting to me is that he also reflects a lot about his own ignorance. That he says, well, I was very qualified in speaking about the US context, but I just never understood what was happening in Palestine until I went there. And then it's very productive, I think, what he writes about his knowledge process. So I think this is also important to acknowledge that people can gain more knowledge about context, because sometimes following the debates also here in Vienna, for example, if I'm allowed to add this also, I have the impression sometimes it's a bit like, oh, this comes too late, this should have been earlier, and this is not so comprehensive or whatever as a position as we would love to have it. And I think this is not very productive. But this is my personal, it's not an analysis, it's my personal position that I think we have to appreciate also people who acknowledge earlier gaps in knowing and the efforts to know more about topics. And I think it's in terms of creating alliances and solidarity work, we should probably welcome those journeys, whether they're real journeys or journeys through literature. Yeah, I think I've reached my concluding thoughts. I also have this wonderful and much too long quote by Andrea Meeson, who actually also closed her talk in the webinar by saying, solidarity in my mind begins with examining through a critical lens your history. If you're white and of European descent, identify and challenge our history, the ways it contributes to blatant injustices beyond borders, also just outside our front doors. Then do solidarity well, do it collaboratively, do it as an ally, not with need to be in the spotlight, to have the most likes on Facebook or retweets on Twitter, share your experiences, but also know when to put down the microphone and stand back and listen. And that's what I want to do now. Put down the microphone and listen to your questions. Thank you very much for listening.